All right, perfect. So we will jump in and get started. We will start our program session titled "The Campus is Gone: Student Perspectives of the Campus Experience During COVID-19." We've got Ivan from the University of Miami, and we will let Ivan take over and get started.
Thank you, Dante. Appreciate the introduction. As he stated, my name is Ivan Ceballos. I work at the University of Miami as the Executive Director for Residential Life. This presentation is quite different than previous SEAHO presentations I've done. This is largely based on my dissertation research. I am a doctoral candidate at Florida International University, and in exactly 3 weeks from today, I will be defending my dissertation. So perhaps this is a good warm-up to what will be. And initially, when I submitted the proposal, thank you for the woos. This was intended to be some excerpts of data and conversations I had with some student participants about their experiences with COVID. However, as I started to really work through this presentation, I realized that it's not really feasible to cleanly separate my work and experiences as a doctoral candidate with that of an employee that works in housing and residential life. So this is a blend. This is a blending of excerpts and narratives from my research, as well as accounts from my working in housing and residential life. It's my hope that this offers some insight and reflection for this group that is not necessarily COVID specific, because ideally and hopefully COVID will be temporary, and I think we will collectively be ready for the next pandemic if and when that were to occur. However, I think there are some lessons learned that were meaningful for me and continue to be, and I certainly hope they are for you as well. So I'm going to share my screen. I have practiced. I'm not very good at some of the technical features of Zoom, and so I just need a thumbs up or something if I do it correctly. So, do folks see my presentation here? Can I get a head nod or thumbs up? I got it right. Thank you, Caitlin, for the thumbs up and the head nods. So, obligatory title slide. There you go. So, I wanted to provide some context as far as who I am and the perspectives I bring to this presentation and work. I'm a res lifer, always have been, going on 12-ish years now. Prior to that, I was working in fraternity and sorority life, and I think, as we know, there's a lot of overlap on the kinds of skills that we have between res life, fraternity and sorority life, etc. For whatever reason, perhaps it is not just me, but crisis tends to follow me wherever I go. I think that anyone that works in res life or has worked in res life has probably experienced this as well. Just a few weeks ago, I was in a conversation with some colleagues that it seems like every year there's a major crisis. That could be COVID, that could be a hurricane or hurricanes, Zika, the list goes on and on. And so crisis tends certainly to be something that I think I have become proficient at, as I know many of you all have. Academically, I've been working on my PhD for 4 years and counting now. And really, as I mentioned earlier, the findings and the narratives I'm going to use are based on that study. I'm very interested in campus environments, environmental psychology, and otherwise how people and their surroundings interact with one another. I've also done some research on citation network analyses. Are folks here familiar with how college affects students? You know, those really, really big books that you may have used in grad school here or there. So I did a study in which we coded the degree granting institutions of all the authors that are cited. And if you ever flip through that book, it's a lot of citations. And what we pretty much found is that our collective understanding of student engagement, which is really defined as educationally meaningful involvement, and what the institution does to entice students to be involved, is really based on a very particular kind of student and a very particular kind of institution. And I think we tend to refer to this as traditional, right? the 4-year residential-based institution, the first-time full-time college student, is how our understandings of engagement tends to be understood. At the same time, there's more and more research, including How College Affects Students, the third volume, that at its most core argument is that students are changing. Students are diversifying. They're really challenging higher education as far as what's in it for me, especially with the costs. Even living on campus and the outcomes of that have changed over time, and I think alarmingly have some concerning implications for mental health. I utilize photo elicitation, so you'll see photographs on almost every slide. Photo elicitation is an interview method that I really enjoy, and if anyone is currently involved in research, qualitative research, or planning this down the road, it's a really cool method, and it's almost a bit of a trick. With photo elicitation, you ask participants to share photos and talk about them. The data is not necessarily about the photos themselves, although they can be, but it seems like nothing gets people talking like a good photo. And so it's a bit of a trick to get people talking, and it has been a really fascinating interview technique because, as one student put it, it's easier to talk about the photos rather than myself, even though in theory they are talking about themselves through the photos. So I also wanted to share in context, I'm the father of 2 preschoolers, and I also experienced COVID. I've come to appreciate breathing, something that I know has affected many, many people. And so I share this because the timing of these interviews happened early on during the pandemic. Right now, we have what we are probably exhausted of hearing, the new normal. When these interviews were occurring was about April, May of 2020, when we collectively were still figuring out what it is we were doing. So that could have been, are we opening, are we closing as far as our residence halls? Are we going to go online or in person the following year? Am I going to have a job? So this was during that period where there was a lot of uncertainty. Not to say that there isn't any now. And so during that time, I myself had to homeschool virtually preschoolers, which did not go well. I think I'm better in higher ed than I am in preschool education. But all this was happening at the same time. And I think that's important context. As I mentioned, this is really based on my dissertation and the work experiences. To contextualize this a little bit, the early days of COVID, and it sounds like so far at the sessions I've attended, we all kind of made some similar decisions. We closed early. For us, it was during March of 2020. We refunded students. We let our student employees go. We've had some financial mitigation efforts, and we had differing approaches to how we resumed in the fall. Some folks reduced occupancy, others didn't, others did not open. At the University of Miami, we opened in the fall. We let students cancel their housing agreements if they wanted. Our fall occupancy was about 72%, which is fairly high compared to the conversations I've had today alone. Currently, our occupancy is about 85%, which is pretty darn near our typical 93 to 96% occupancy. So that's to say we had a lot of students living on campus currently. And so about this study, as I mentioned, I'm very curious about this idea of student engagement, which again, tends to be understood as what students are doing to be meaningfully involved in their education. Traditionally, we have come to understand engagement through high impact practices or certain behaviors, like living on campus, studying abroad, service learning. There are some activities some of you all may have experienced, advise, or work with that probably lend themselves to student engagement. However, based on some recent research, it's a little more complicated than just doing something, right? As you've probably experienced when you work with students, doing something may not necessarily be meaningful. I'm doing this just because I thought it was a good idea at the time. Mom said I should do it. It would look good at my resume. So really what I wanted to get at is, what does a student consider to be meaningful involvement? That's the core question I'm trying to get at. What is super important is this idea of place and space and critical geography. These are not the same terms. And I know in housing, we love to use these terms, place and space, or spaces inclusive spaces, learning spaces. At its most basic level, a place is an experience, or socially, how a place should be experienced. So consider, for example, the campus of the University of Miami and how that should be experienced. Participants who were undergraduate students that lived on campus spoke at length about how they experienced the campus versus what they thought they should be experiencing the campus, right? Frat culture, partings, etc. But I'm not into that, so I'm not really part of the normal crowd. And so it's this kind of comparison of what I experienced versus what I think I should experience. That's kind of the basics of place. Space is when you throw in the social stuff, the social identities, politics, power, privilege, that really complicates things. So to bring this back to student engagement, the idea of living on campus, given that we work in housing, comes to mind, where ideally students that live on campus are engaged, meaningfully involved. There are, of course, implications, let's say with first generation students or students that cannot afford, at least in our case, up to $23,000 a year to live on campus. And so that really speaks to space complicating a person's experience. I interviewed 5 participants. I went through a lot of data. I had 24 interviews with these 5 participants. They submitted a total of 60 photographs. I went through and coded 369 pages of transcripts. If you've ever done qualitative research, I think the worst part is hearing your own voice for hours and hours at end. At the end, I had 882 codes using in vivo, in which I broke down, and I also wrote about almost 500 annotations, which range from a few sentences to 15 pages of notes based on particular excerpts. That's a photo of my son. If you've ever been nervous, he snuck into the office and started typing on my dissertation when I went to go have a snack break. So now I locked the door in our house just in case, but isn't he cute? I finished my dissertation data collection before COVID. Actually, at SEAHO last year, I was very happy because I thought I was done with data collection. I finished my interviews, my committee was happy with the work I had done. It was time to code, analyze, and defend. Given the nature of place and space in my study, I really had to re-engage participants and ask them about their experiences. And here are the key questions I asked them about their experience. How are you experiencing the campus, and what does meaningful involvement look like now? So I had to extend my study in order to really capture what I was trying to get. Some disclaimers that I think are worth mentioning. The University of Miami is a private institution. How students on our campus experience college, especially during COVID, is probably very different than, say, at a 2-year college or a public college. The timing of responses, as I mentioned, was early in the pandemic. How a student is experiencing campus now is probably very different than when they were essentially evicted. Going back to March, you had to be approved to stay on campus, which was fairly limited to students who were either from abroad, a small group of student athletes, or some other extenuating circumstances. Besides that, students were evicted. We may not see it like that for obvious reasons, but as I will share, the student perspectives were very different. So some takeaways I really want for this group from these vignettes that I'm going to share, which is only 4. And again, I have almost 400 pages of transcripts, and I'm only focusing on what I consider to be 4 important points for future consideration in our collective practice. One is, what does this mean for me as a practitioner? And I, probably like many of us, really feed off of student interactions. No offense to my colleagues like Elizabeth, but they only sustain me so much. It's really experiences with students that I find to be the most exciting, the most thrilling, the most engaging for myself. And really going back to last March, it just wasn't there, right? I don't know about you, but I really can go weeks without seeing a student, especially early on in the pandemic. I mentioned earlier on a panel I was on, I went about 3 months before I met the new employees on my team in person, just because of the nature of remote work, physical distancing, and those things, which posted some challenges. And so as I go through this, I would like you to think about, as I do, how can this be incorporated or lessons learned for beyond the pandemic? What are some other aspects that these vignettes can serve a purpose? This photograph here was the first photograph I took of Lakeside Village, which was our brand new residential area once the fences were removed. We had been working on this new building since 2012, and we were planning a whole lot of pomp and circumstance for the grand opening in the fall. It was almost an afterthought in light of the pandemic. How do you open a new building when all this is going on? So it was a bit of a, well, here it is. There's the new building. Hope students enjoy it, despite the insurmountable challenges. I will share, there is a mildly graphic photo that will come up in just a couple of slides. It's a painting, so it's not anything too much, but I just don't want you to be surprised. And I'll certainly explain why that student submitted that. So I pose this question for the group. You could either raise your hand if you feel comfortable sharing verbally or turning on your camera or your microphone, or feel free to enter the text in the chat. For us, the date was March 13th. This was the day after we announced we would close. And so when I was preparing this presentation, I was having some flashbacks of what was going through my mind on that day, the day after we closed. And so I asked you, what was going through your mind once your institution said, here's what we're doing in a public fashion? So I invite you to think back to when that happened, in the middle of that probably chaos. What did that look like? I'm going to stop sharing so I could see folks and see the chat better. So please, if you don't mind me sharing, what was going through your mind when this was going? Caitlin shared, if she doesn't mind me reading, I was so sad for my student staff members who were seniors, and this was the end of their time. Absolutely. Actually, I'm going to talk about that in one of my slides. Is for me, 4 of my participants were seniors. And what I thought was the last interview was all about, you know, my graduation, I'm going to do the walk, here's my last trip, all these things. And then it just was an abrupt end, and it was a sense of loss. Thank you for sharing. Caitlin.
I was thinking, if we don't have students here, am I going to have a job? Do I have to start job searching out of this field that I love and my resume is built for? And then also, if they do come back, which thankfully they did, how do we create an experience for them that replicates anything close to the semblance of normalcy that we have? And being in a freshman area, thinking, how do I make this something that they want to return to for their sophomore year?
Such good points. Thank you so much. These are all very good comments that are being shared in the chat. Would anyone like to share in person? I'll share my own. I think Caitlin said it. I was not sure if I was going to have a job. And being very sincere and vulnerable with this group, nor if my staff would have a job. And also, I experienced this sadness for students, and also what was going to happen with my children. What do I do with them? At the same time, professionally, I have never been busier and stressed. And at the same time, by the way, you need to homeschool these children now. And so all that is going through my mind while I am supposed to, at least at the time, I thought, exude all is well. There's a scene from Animal House, which I know it's an old reference, where it's chaos, and you have the chapter president going, all is well, all is calm, we're doing fine. Meanwhile, the hamsters are spinning. Would anyone else like to share? Yvette, I don't.
There, Ivan.
Okay,
My apologies for not having the camera on right now, but they're doing some facilities work, so you know the drill. But I appreciate what you said, Caitlin, especially about the job security. I think that's a big one. Especially vulnerable right now since Ivan, you are my boss. But certainly felt that. I wrote in the chat too, it felt very overwhelming, and I feel like, and I don't know what other people feel like, but I think that we'll be feeling like the mental health effects for a long time. Like I feel like I've almost blocked out like some of the experiences, and which is strange because I'm trying to recall, like, how did we get all those people out? My building is like 600 people. I'm like, how did all of that happen? I know I was there and I know I did it. And I think I can remember specific things, but at the same time, I feel like very like I'm just actively trying not to go back to it as well, which is concerning, obviously. But it's just an overwhelming thing to think about.
Thank you for sharing. Did anyone else want to share before I move on?
I'll also add from a slightly different perspective. I was a grad student when this happened and was going through the search process for my first professional position. And being close to family was very important to me, even before the pandemic. But it really was a conflict because I had to kind of broaden the scope of where I was looking at for jobs because so many positions were starting to get canceled. And that was a really big internal battle of I'm now looking to move hours away from family during this pandemic just to have job security. So I think that was a very difficult experience to have. I luckily ended up 50 minutes away from family, but I know that many people were not that fortunate.
Thank you, DJ. Also, you put in the comments about concerns with those not having housing stability. There's a great article by the New York Times months ago about how campus can provide illusions of equity. And one of my participants spoke about having to take a physics quiz in her car in a UN parking garage so she can have stable Wi-Fi. So even something that we consider basic as far as having internet access became very complicated. Yet at the same time, take this quiz, take this test, do this project during this time. Miami traffic, so 50 minutes for me is 4 miles. And so hopefully that's not the case for you. Anyways, okay, I'm gonna move on to some vignettes from student participants. I'm going to put up my screen one more time. This was the headline on March 11th of the Miami hurricane. And I think this puts how much changed in 2 days. So the headline, this is the headline in the first paragraph really, which is what we probably think of as back in the day spring break, right? We can sleep in late, we could rest, not worry about finals. And I laughed when I found this article because, oh boy, did things change just 48 hours later, such as where am I gonna stay? I need internet access. What am I gonna do for food? Those kinds of things. And so I put that on there because it shows how quickly things changed. So here's an excerpt from one of the participants, Andrew. I use pseudonyms for obvious reasons. And first, I'll talk about the photograph he decided to share with me because you're probably looking at that and go, is that someone's head being cut off? And it is. This is a painting by Caravaggio. If any art history majors are in the room, you probably have seen this before. It's about Holofernes cutting off the head of a Syrian soldier. And I asked why, because remember the question was, how do you feel meaningfully engaged, especially during COVID? And he shared this photo with me. This is a physical therapy student who, in the midst of all this chaos, was taking an art history class as an elective. And he wrote a paper only for the faculty member to reach out to him and said, I don't think you understood the assignment. You gave me what you probably read online about what this painting is about, but I want you to tell me what you think. You tell me how you interpret this. And so he talked about, and of course I'm paraphrasing here, he talked about agency, that this faculty member reached out to him at a time where he was kind of just going through the motions and trying to make sense of things, as having some sense of agency in how he interprets and creates his academic experience. And so I thought that was very powerful and speaks to student subjectivity. What are some arenas we can give them, or at least recognize their agency in making decisions and interpreting, whether that is a curricular assignment, whether that is a student employee position. And I thought that was very powerful. When talking about his experience, his biggest gripe was about trying to access information. And so one of my favorite phrases was a dumpster fire of nonsense everywhere. It's all just been so interesting. It's just been a dumpster fire of nonsense everywhere. I've been trying to read about actual information and stuff about what's going on. Like there are such huge implications and people are suffering. I get that it's obviously unprecedented, but I couldn't even predict what would happen. Andrew, this part of the story Andrew shared was going through his mind as he was in a hostel in Europe because 2 days prior, they left to spring break. It was his senior year. Someone alluded to, you know, kind of the senior year closure, my last trip. And he didn't know if he should come back home, if classes were going to go back, what's going on with the borders. And so I could not imagine being in his shoes going, what do I do? Do I go home? Do I stay here? Am I going back to UM? Am I going? Just like we were trying to make sense of things, there is a sense of where can I even get accurate information that I know has been a challenge for many of us. Another participant, Esther, she self-identified as a Black Haitian woman. And she spoke at length throughout our interviews about the importance of representation, frankly, the lack of it that she has observed. And in the rare instances of seeing representation was this sense of meaningful involvement. Like I belong here because I see myself here. And she shared this photograph. I do not speak French. And according to her, what this says is the truth is I can see you. She took this photo. There was actually an art exhibit just off campus at it's an area called Coral Gables with a lot of outdoor areas. And she shared this photograph because she felt that when there were times of representation, she felt seen or heard. And in this particular example, this is a dance student, and she commented many times that it really took her till junior year to start seeing other Black students in classes. And so here, finally, she felt like she found someone who she can connect with based on their backgrounds and their interests in dance, only for that to be lost. And so she spoke about experiencing loss during this pandemic of that kind of representation that she was starting to get to. So in her words, I had just met this other girl in my class. She was the only other Black girl in the class. We started talking, but we got cut off so abruptly that I guess I'll never see her again. What's the goal of the class now? They just give us assignments, but not really to learn. We just submit recordings of hand gestures and fill our assignments. If you talk to students during this latter part of the spring, it was fairly absurd what students were being asked to do. And I'm certainly not trying to critique faculty here because no one had gone through this. I could not imagine, nor do I have a good idea on how you could successfully continue a dance class virtually, especially if you're working on group routines, as was her case. Are any folks here supervisors of student employees or have been in some way, shape, or form? This story was very concerning to me because in retrospect, I wish I would have communicated information sooner, although I did not have that information. And I think someone in the chat put about being new in their role, being at the table, but not having information. I certainly felt that here. I'll start with the excerpt. My supervisors were like my moms on campus. I was building professional relationships with deans and stuff. I got more connected with the campus. It was a very valuable experience, but I'm not able to work anymore. I was put out of my own job on campus. I wasn't getting paid. I sent emails. 2.5 weeks went by. That's when I decided to file for unemployment. Devin reminded me of a student employee who is engaged, meaning they love their job. They're learning skills from their job. If we do our work right, whether that's with a resident assistant, some kind of student employee, desk assistant, this is what we want, right? Like my supervisor is my mentor. They help me make sense of life. I'm developing skills. On the other end, we get work done that is so important to our mission. That's awesome. These are all good things. At least for Devin, that was stripped away suddenly. And I was reminded that students were left in limbo and really depending on some benefits that come with it, such as the money. And so in this conversation, the university wasn't responding, right? And we did the same thing, and I'll certainly own up to that, is we dismissed over 200 student employees because we closed. Thank you, but we're closed. We can no longer use you. And I think we did harm by doing that in retrospect. At the time, that was the only option we can do. Sometime later, thankfully, especially with the CARES Act, we were able to issue compensation for student employees for the remainder of the academic year. So that's the good news. We came around to that. But if you're trying to buy food or rent, which is why Devin submitted this photo, is I have a lease and my landlord does not give a fill in the blank if I have a job or not. I still got to pay rent. And so how can you be, this goes back to Maslow 101, how can you be meaningfully involved in your education if you don't even know how you're going to pay for housing? The last vignette was from a super involved student, and I'll share the excerpt. Everything on campus is so intimate. You can do things that impact other people. I made a name for myself and did things I'm proud of. Being part of the campus and interacting with students and administrators every day who are just so happy with their jobs was just so cool. Now everything is missing. The campus is gone. You know, now I'm just waiting for my diploma in the mail. So engagement here, which again is being involved in educationally purposeful ways, came through a very physical attachment to the campus. Here, this is a photo of our student union right across the lake. And so this is a student who, again, super involved in orientation, student activities, et cetera, and that was taken away. And so there's a physical aspect, and I think in our work, I think it was Caitlin who had mentioned it about replicating the kind of cool stuff students were doing on campus. How do you do that off campus? I have not figured that out. I'd be a great consultant if I did. I think certainly we could discuss that as well, but there's such a physical, obviously physical aspect to living on campus that just cannot be replicated living off campus. And Maria's example, I had never thought of this before. Maria is not American. She is an international student. Her parents are from abroad. And what I found very interesting was her parents considered her involvement in the residence halls and on campus. The term they used was unpaid labor. Student organization involvement, volunteering with our community service center, the Butler Center, was deemed as unpaid involvement. I'm sorry, unpaid labor, which I had never thought of being involved as unpaid labor. But in negotiating the cultural implications of being involved in the ways that you and I may understand it, now that the campus is gone, there really was just no opportunity to be engaged because the physical aspects were gone. I'll stop sharing here. Those are the 4 vignettes I wanted to share with this group. I wanted to open it up if anyone had any reactions. Did any of this resonate with you? Were there other conversations or observations you had with whether students you work with or no otherwise, and how they experienced the early onset of the pandemic? And more importantly, what are implications for future practice?
I can start. Hi again, Elizabeth. I'm an area director. I guess I'm also like a deep reflector, so I'm still just kind of thinking about the stories, all the lives of these students who shared with you. I think that I keep coming back to the woman who shared that she met another, like the only other Black girl in her class. And now that they're just gone and that connection is lost and what that means and representation. I keep coming back to that story because I've been thinking a lot about what connection looks like right now and just the sense of, and I've heard this so far from even staff members, is living on like a predominantly white floor. How it feels right now with COVID when you're trying to stay in more and isolate more, that we can't have more like affinity spaces that are physical, and what that feels like and what that looks like. So that one's just resonating with me right now because this has been on my mind. Is So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. Like I said, I'm a reflector, so it takes me a while to put my words together, but that's where I'm at right now.
Thank you for sharing, Elizabeth. You reminded me there's this article, it's quite old, but very, very relevant, by Peter Magolda about the campus tour. And he talks about spaces that are enclaves and spaces that are traditions. And without those enclaves, so for that student who chooses to participate in small selective enclaves, when you lose that, you lose community, which is, we have seen, right? We're in person, but we're not really. I was just reviewing the terms of employment for RAs for next year earlier today. And in our expectations, we have specifically told them to stay away from residents as much as possible, which is so counterintuitive. So I think Elizabeth speaks to, there's a physical experience, but we have not been able to provide the emotional experience through enclaves, through connecting with one another. And it has certainly taken a toll. I'm sure many of us have seen increases in mental health concerns. I joke that I miss the good old days of roommate arguments and alcohol, because the incidents we tend to get these days are just not quite what they used to be. I'll even share, there was a student who, she did not make a good choice about 2 weeks ago. This is not one of the participants, and so you met with me. Fun fact, now the Dean of Students Office sanctions you to meet with me, which I didn't think that being punished by talking to me would be a good thing, but here we are. And for the first time in my career, she called me last week just to talk. I'm feeling lonely, I'm feeling stressed, I don't know who else to talk to. And if you're calling the executive director because you don't know how to talk to, even though you live on campus for almost a year now, it's alarming. And I don't think it's the RA's fault. I don't think it's the AD's fault, because they're doing just what they can. But you could only get so far in developing enclaves through GroupMe messages.
One of my reactions was to what one of the students shared, like, I'm just waiting for my degree in the mail at this point. And it makes me think of all of the times I've heard from students, whether it was in a conduct case or just in passing, or even my staff, with, why am I here? And then I have parents asking, why am I spending this much to send my kid here? Where's the discount for everything that they're missing out on? And while that is a really good question, what is the monetary value that you can put on the social experience? Because through that social experience, you get to grow and learn how you've been wrong or how you've been right, and who you want to become. What price can you even put on that? So I understand the question of what are you giving back to us for what you're not able to provide, but how do you even put a value on it? So that's what was going through my mind when we have students that are just doing this just to get the degree instead of to get the experience, because we can't provide it to them right now.
Caitlin, thank you for sharing. You brought up a good point, which I think has been a lesson that I've learned through reading these vignettes as an administrator, is knowing the audience. I do not mean to knock my friends that work in communications and marketing, but I think Caitlin is reflecting the kinds of questions we tend to get asked, right? Like, what's in this for me? Why would I pay to live on campus during this environment, or some of those things, if you're even able to. And I think about, especially where I sit, kind of behind the scenes or at the table, to use some nomenclature that was used earlier, what is discussed versus the message that is outputted to the rest of the community, and who is the audience. And I worry that it doesn't always get across after we communicate through press releases for so long, that we may be missing the mark. And I'm no communications expert, nor do I pretend to be one. But it seems like administratively we speak one language, where students and perhaps their families may be speaking another at times. I think about this, such as going back to March 11th and 12th, we sent very specific press releases out that didn't really capture the questions that were being asked, such as Andrew's dumpster fire of misinformation, as he stated, and who to call, because that's the other thing we have experienced even nowadays, is who do I call if I need to talk to someone? If I don't know about financial aid and it's taken them 3 days to call me back, what do I do? So it seems like that's also been a series of challenges. something else that I'll share, especially this notion of the dumpster fire of misinformation, is clearly students had to negotiate different kinds of bureaucracy. And I think we lost our greatest asset, which is the student employees. I don't know what other institutions did, but we had to discontinue them. And if I were to go back in time, I think I would have continued their roles as much as possible, obviously adapted, because the residents know the RA. You know, hey, Elizabeth, I have a question, or at least they can feel seen or be part of a community as they're going through this, because I think the communities were taken apart once we closed as well. And so we got rid of that psychological community as well. And so, again, our first time going through this, my first time going through a pandemic, I admit that my first COVID meeting was actually during SEAHO last year. And in my mind, I was approaching this at the time as if it were Zika, which hit Miami particularly hard when that happened. So, okay, we'll get through this, and this will be, you know, we'll just continue our operations, which clearly did not happen. But I think what it speaks to is that without the physical and the emotional connections, we don't really have community in the meaningful way through these important enclaves. I see it's 1:58. Shame on me for not saving more time for questions and discussion. I think we have time maybe for one question or comment before Dante takes us home.